Thank you. Um, Good morning, everyone, and it's really a privilege to be here. I'd like to extend my gratitude to KMI and WMU for inviting me for the second time. It's really exciting to be here in Busan. I'm visiting South Korea for the first time. So, the outline of my presentation, I will first of all talk about why this topic is important. We have already heard about illegal fishing, the implications, and the laws around it. And whilst my presentation would toe some of those lines, it will also want to paint some of the bigger picture to understand why we should not stop at just talking. We talk about these things, but the reality is that it has real life implications on millions of people on the African continent, many of whom are in Western Central Africa. So after introducing the importance of a topic, I will look at the main actors in Africa's fisheries before focusing on industrial vessels primarily. And one of the reasons why I'm focusing on industrial vessels and their activities is for the same reason that the last U in IUU is hardly spoken about. When it is unregulated, it is not necessarily illegal. And so the same case applies for a lot of the artisanal vessels on the African continent. It is not a case that the activities is illegal, but the fact that a lot of their fishing is unregulated. Therefore, if we're going to silence the last U in IUU in the context of the activities of industrial vessels, then in my presentation, I see the activities of the industrial vessels as more relevant than that of the artisanal vessels because of their contributions to, or the contributions of the latter to illegal fishing in comparison to the other. I would also look at the impacts of unsustainable practices and the general impact of depleting fish stock. Before looking at some of the government and international partners to efforts to ensure sustainability and the implications it is having on the artisanal sector and coastal communities, before reflecting on some of the things we can do differently, and then the conclusion. So fish is an important source of food security for millions of people on the African continent. Is also an important source of animal protein, contributing up to 80% of the animal proteins consumed by coastal communities, and sometimes is the only source of animal protein consumed by select coastal communities throughout the continent. According to the World Bank, if we're looking at the economic contribution, the fisheries and aquaculture sector on the African continent contributes an estimated $24 billion each year. The figures could be more, but this is the current statistics that we're working with. And in also trying to highlight or show you the importance of fishing for the ordinary people in coastal communities throughout the continent, I'd like to describe or use a description of fishing by the president of Bonny Indigenous Fishing Community when I asked him, so why continue if fishing is becoming so problematic? And he talked about fishing being a chain empowerment scheme. So it's not just about him. For instance, if it's no longer beneficial to him, there are also implications for other people. So he is a fisher, and then he's also able to empower 15 other people that are either fishmongers or processors or distributors or unloaders. And this also helps us to highlight some of the relationship between fishing and how it contributes to, I guess you could say, the gendered nature of fishing and its contribution to gender equality, wherein in many communities, when men fish, women process. And so they have this relationship that has gone on traditionally that needs to be sustained in terms of the positive contribution that fishing or sustainable fishing, or when it's there, makes to fishing communities, the men fishing primarily and the women processing and selling. And this importance of fishing as a chain empowerment scheme is reflected in the fact that in Guinea, for example, for every fisherman's job, an additional 3.5 additional onshore jobs are created. And in talking about the contributions of fisheries to livelihoods, the current statistics that is almost thrown around is that 10 to 15 million Africans rely on fishing as a primary source of livelihood, with an additional 90 million as a diversified source of livelihood. But this figure could be problematic because in Nigeria alone, over 8 million people rely on fishing directly as a source of livelihood, and an additional 19 million directly or indirectly. So if in Nigeria, over 24 million people relies on fisheries directly or indirectly, it means the stats for Africa obviously needs to change. So the issue of data comes to mind in terms of how are we actually updating our data and collecting the data on some of these issues. And when it comes to highlighting the importance of women again in fishing and how they are the gap or the bridge between the fisherman and the final consumers, about 80% of the fish or seafood is marketed in West Africa is marketed by women. So it shows you again the gendered nature of fisheries, wherein if we should assume that men predominantly fish, then women process. And talking about some of the experiences I have in my research, it is a fact that a lot of the fishing activities that are done by men is in fact funded by women, of which without the women and the finances by the women, the men would practically, especially those in the artisanal sector, not be able to fish. I'm highlighting this so that we can think about, I guess by the end of my presentation, you will see why it's important for us to, of course, focus on the people that fish directly, but also think about the people that are invisible in terms of those that are not the fishers, that are not directly affected by the illegal or overexploitation of fisheries, which are the fishers, but then on the other side, there are people that are not necessarily visibly represented. Hence, I'm trying to emphasize the women and the role that they also play in the fisheries sector. And so, again, trying to understand why this topic is important, I'm highlighting illegal fishing and the figures that you see here and the overexploitation. But before we get here, I want to talk briefly about some of the factors that are contributing to depletion and why illegal fishing and general overexploitation through legal fishing is actually very problematic and something we must speak about a lot more than we do currently. In the Niger Delta area of Nigeria, it is estimated that 60% of the fisheries species in the Gulf of Guinea breed in the mangroves of the Niger Delta. However, since oil exploration started in 1958, about 40% of the mangroves forests have been oiled. The implication, of course, it means that the 60% of the breeding ground of this fish has been disrupted, and so this automatically contributes to depletion of fish stock. And we also have the impact of toxic waste dumping, either by vessels operating throughout the countries on the African continent, and how they contribute to further depletion. We also have the impact of climate change. Although research is quite futuristic in telling us about the impact of climate change, so much so that one of the, I think a blog by the World Bank noted in 2017 that unless fisheries governance is improved in Africa, primarily West Africa, that fish production is likely to reduce by 26%. For countries like Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana, the figures is 53%, 56%, and 60% respectively. But the reality, however, is that as of today, according to a research by Daniels et al. In 2016, about 50% of the fishery species in the waters between Nigeria and Senegal is already overexploited. And therefore, this tells us the impact of climate change, not just as a futuristic thing, but how it is exacerbating a problem that is already upon us. And this is where legal fishing comes in. Despite the fact that a lot of fish stock are depleted or overexploited, and therefore should be allowed to be regenerated or regenerate, we see the species presented in Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreement. Select tuna species that are already overexploited that shouldn't even be in such agreement are still on the table. Species like Sardinella in West Africa, countries like Senegal and the Gambia are also part of the so-called Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreement. And therefore, the continuous focus on illegal fishing more or less hides the fact that legal overexploitation or legal fishing of fish stocks that is already overexploited is also an issue and undermines not just the food security of millions of people on the African continent that depends on fish for their livelihoods, but potentially, and I hope by the end of this presentation, you can see how it also undermines the national, regional, and continental security of a continent. And so this is why I want to start by sort of sharing with you the extent of the depletion before we now start talking about the implications or some of the cost of it, including how illegal fishing is then making things worse. In 2012, the former president of the African Union noted that illegal fishing have cost the African continent in the last 5 decades, that's 50 years, over $200 billion. Of course, the clandestine nature of the threat or the crime makes it impossible for us to put a true figure to it. So a lot of the times, all the statistics you see are either reconstructed or just statistics, because you can't really know how much you're losing because you're not catching people in the act of that crime. In West Africa alone, research published in 2017 by Doumbouya et al. Noted that 6 West African countries, Mauritania, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, loses an estimated $2.3 billion each year to illegal fishing. And in terms of the representation, although IUU fishing is noted here, but the legal element of the IUU, it is for the African continent, it is noted to represent an estimated 45% of the legally reported catch. And this is according to a 2016 report by AU-IBAR. This is an agency within the African Union. And the second one in terms of West Africa is taken from the 2009 research published by Agnew and the Doumbouya et al. 2017 that noted that 40 to 65% of illegal fishing represent 40 to 65% of the legally reported catch for West Africa, making it the highest level on the African continent. 44% for Central Africa, 47% for Northern Africa, and 32% of Eastern Africa. And the implication in terms of the implication of the depletion on the livelihoods of artisanal fishers is then that in the last decade, the income of artisanal fishers have reduced by up to 40%. Again, these figures could be worse because so many fishers are leaving the fish trade because it is no longer sustainable for them to continue. So these are some of the reasons why it's important for us to talk about this. So who are the main actors in African fisheries? We have the artisanal fishers. They are the main actors because of the way they contribute to the food security and economic security of the people. And then we have the industrial fishers, many of whom either gain access to Africa's water through agreement or licensing or beneficial ownership, which also obviously brings room to some of the loopholes we'll be looking at later. So in West African countries, this is for the 6 FCWC countries, for instance, about 70% of the estimated 1.293 tons of fish produced each year are by artisanal canoes, estimated at about 200,000 people doing the fishing. And at the industrial level, about 523 industrial and semi-industrial vessels were licensed to fish in the 6 FCWC countries. This Benin Republic, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Togo, and Liberia, I believe, and I hope I've not gotten the countries wrong. And in terms of the industrial vessels and their contribution to fisheries on the African continent, an estimated 25% of all the fish catch, this is according to an FAO statistics from 2014, is by industrial vessels. The catch, however, is that they're able to exploit this 25% by paying an estimated $0.4 billion, either through fisheries agreement or licensing. And then this report noted that if this particular contribution were to be, or these catches were to be extracted by Africans, they would have been earning anything around $3.3 billion each year. So this sort of gives an example of how the amount of money that is exchanged through disagreements or licenses pale into insignificance, especially when you compare the fact that a lot of the countries that enter these agreements do not actually have or have limited capacity to monitor the activities of the vessels they are licensing, which gives room to this fish until you drop that happens in a lot of the countries at the high seas. And so how are industrial vessels contributing to overexploitation on the African continent? They do this through transshipment at sea. And so a lot of you might already know this, but there are also research. I think we've also heard this from the presentations or the keynote speeches by Dr. D here yesterday, especially, that talks about the fisheries crime and the link between maybe one crime in the fisheries sector and another. But I wanted to highlight transshipment because of how it is not only problematic in its contribution to overexploitation, but also how it is linked to other threats on the African continent, primarily in West Africa. It is linked to laundering of illegally caught fish. Of course, it's been transshipped at sea to avoid detection. It is also linked to illegal oil bunkering, because if you're hanging around at sea to either engage in illegal fishing or engage in transshipment, you also need supplies to be able to fuel your vessel. And for a lot of the oil producing countries in West Africa, this is a very big concern for them. So this is also an issue. And with this, it's also linked to pollution, because where are you discarding your waste whilst you are at the high sea engaging in this? It is also linked to human arms and drugs trafficking. And interestingly, it is also linked to piracy and armed robbery at sea. If the criminals know that money is exchanging hands at the high seas, it makes you susceptible and easy prey for them, because they know you as a criminal would not report a crime that you're committing. But again, this is a topic for a different day, in that regardless of this assumption that a criminal will not likely report themselves, we see this also happening where a criminal is actually proudly able to report themselves, but only the difference is that they are reporting that they have been pirated. And so a lot of the time the focus is on the piracy report without necessarily thinking about, so what were you doing there in the first place, or what is actually going on there in the first place. And so when we talk about transshipment at sea, there's also transshipment that involves collusion between the industrial vessels and the artisanal vessels. And for so long, we've seen a lot of examples cited with Ghana's cycle, which the government have finally addressed. Obviously, we can see how things plays out in terms of how it's been implemented and actually put an end to. But as of last year, the government have stopped it. But it also goes on in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, and so many other countries. Besides, if you do not have eyes on the sea, which unfortunately for many fisheries agencies across West and Central Africa, they do not have one, either a patrol vessel or even the capacity, the human capacity to monitor what goes on, or the activities of the vessels they've licensed. And then there is abuse of vessels registry, which then facilitates illegal fishing or fishing activities globally, but also on the African continent. And the interesting thing about this abuse of vessel registry is how vessels that would ordinarily, maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, would have been identified as engaging in illegal fishing, are now finding ways to circumvent this illegal fishing by, going through a flag of convenience or flag of non-compliance, which unfortunately is a very big issue now on the African continent, because so many countries are interested in the money and are willingly flagging vessels even when they do not have the wherewithal to monitor the activities of these vessels. So they use, in terms of flag of convenience, they use open vessels registry to fish in waters under the national jurisdiction of coastal African states, which then give them access in the same way that local vessels would have also had access. We also have examples of licensing abuses, such as fraudulent licensing and double licensing. And sometimes this is not detectable because of the lack of inter-agency or inter-country cooperation and collaboration. So one vessel, for instance, could go to Ghana and register along Taiwan, for instance, and then go to the Gambia and register the same name. And when they are meeting, or they might have the license to fish in the same country, And when they're meeting, you might not actually know that this is not the long Taiwan that have the access to fish in Ghana. But if you're seeing a long Taiwan, you would assume, oh, it's fine, we don't need to check. But these are two vessels rather than one vessel, if that makes sense. And there are so many examples based on the report published by Raub in 2012, a lot of which are cited on your left, just for you to see examples of some of the vessels that have double names and have had what he described in the report as mirrored meeting. So the vessels coming in and going without enforcers or law enforcement actually noticing what's going on, or that this is actually what's going on. And now I want to focus on flag of convenience on non-compliance and beneficial ownership, just to show you some of the examples of how vessels are doing this and getting away with this. On the African continent, of the 42 FOC countries, about 9 of them are on the African continent. Examples are Cameroon, Comoros, Equatorial Guinea, Liberia, Mauritius, Sao Tome and Principe, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Togo. And this is according to a report or research by Copeland and Raubi that was published last year. The interesting thing about this then is that these countries are willingly flagging these vessels, even when I'm sure they would have read or they would have known that they might not necessarily have the wherewithal to monitor the activities of the vessels, but they enjoy the revenue that comes in. And so I want to give an example of flag of countries or companies that have been implicated for flag of non-compliance or flag of convenience, but with examples from the European Union. And according to a report that was published by African Development Bank last year, they tried to give us an understanding of how the use of flag of convenience or non-compliance by European Union countries sort of emerged. So they talked about how catches by EU fleets reduced or decreased from 3 to 0.5 million tons between 1990 to 2017. But at the same time, something else was happening. And then they also talked about how the collapse of the Soviet blocs resulted in a drastic drop again of the fishing activities of European, not the European Union, but the European catch. But then they talked about the fact that the withdrawal of these vessels then led to something else emerging. A lot of these vessels were then going to countries in the Caribbean to be flagged there and then coming back. So as a result, we saw an increase of such vessels, but that were once or would have been once described as EU vessels before. And so we see reduction in official EU vessels, but then we see an increase in EU vessels that goes elsewhere like the Caribbean to be flagged. We see an increase of exploitation by such vessels. So this is like an example that was given in the report that sort of highlights how, again, maybe for different reasons or different policy introductions or different policy changes by a country might motivate a company or entities to then find more creative ways of then coming back to do the same thing that they have not been allowed to continue in the other way. And then recently a report by Associated Press, and I don't want to say that this report was then one of the things that contributed to the EU finally changing the yellow card that they awarded to Cameroon to a red card early this year. But the research found, or the report found, that 14 vessels from the EU were flagged in Cameroon through flag hoppings, or this flag of convenience or flag of non-compliance, examples of which includes companies or vessels from Belgium, Malta, Latvia, and Cyprus. They were implicated also for IUU fishing related offenses in Cameroon. And so the interesting thing then, or the interesting question I asked myself was, okay, it's good that you have given red card to Cameroon, which obviously shows that they need to put their acts together. So what happens to these vessels then that's been implicated? Is it still then the responsibility of their respective countries to address what they are doing, when we know that a lot of these countries, especially in Latvia, for instance, the fine that is given in cases like that pales into insignificance, that vessels can actually literally continue to do the so-called illegal thing because the amount of money or the fines that are being charged is almost non-existent. And so talking about distant water fishing fleets and their suspicious behavior and how they are contributing to overexploitation, including illegal fishing through beneficial ownership, I want to focus on examples from Asia. But as you can see from the brackets, there's also examples that shows that it's not only Asian countries, just like the flag of convenience of flag of non-compliance is not only EU countries or European countries that are implicated. So beneficial ownership is linked to nationals and companies, a lot of them, especially for West and Central Africa, linked to countries and companies from China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Thailand. And beneficial ownership is the simplest way I can explain is a scenario whereby someone, for instance, in the case of Ghana, where the law emphatically says that only Ghanaians can own vessels, can operate fishing vessels, industrial fishing vessels, and then someone can come and front me as a Ghanaian, but actually the owner of that vessel is either somewhere in China or in South Korea. And so there's an indirect arrangement wherein you're able to front someone as the owner illegally, based on the fact that, of course, this is not legally allowed, because there are countries like Senegal, for instance, that legally allows for beneficial ownership to an extent. So, but for the case of Ghana, this is not the case. The law forbids non-Ghanaians from owning vessels, but we know that based on research, even though officially the officials will tell you that the certificate and the documentation and the investigation shows that these are Ghanaians, and therefore every other data or arguments around beneficial ownership and the fact that over 90% of the vessels operating in Ghana are linked to Asian or Chinese owners is based on speculation rather than the facts. Because officially when you go to them, every documentation shows that these are Ghanaians actually operating the vessels. And so indirectly I've talked about the fact that 90% of industrial vessels operating in Ghana are linked to Chinese ownership. And then examples from South Korea is given by a publication by Raobi in 2021, where they identified the Benofi vessels, the Discoverer, the Master, Frontier, Pathfinder, Commander, Forerunner, Volunteer. They are all Ghanaian flagged and owned by Ghanaian companies, but actually the real owner is the Sila company of South Korea. Again, by that context is of course illegal because it's not legally allowed in Ghana, but this is happening. And these vessels have been identified based on the report by Rabi of activities that are questionable in terms of the way that they are operating in certain West African waters, even though not explicitly identified as engaging in IU fishing, especially for the Benofi vessel. But one of the vessels was attacked by pirates, where it was actually at the time of the attack sort of raised questions. But because of the fact that when such incidents happens, law enforcement are not looking for multiple things, they're focusing on one thing, and therefore the question of whether you are at the wrong place at the right time or the wrong time is never really something that is always reflected on. And a case of a vessel that is also implicated for IU fishing, but has also been attacked by pirates, is the Heilung Feng 11. Actually, this vessel sort of shows an example of success story in terms of the use of technology, but also shows a typical example of how vessels that are engaging in illegal fishing makes themselves quite susceptible to pirate attack. Although in the case of the attack on this vessel, it is not proven, for the same reason that I've given, that they were engaging in illegal fishing at the time that they were attacked. But subsequently in June, the attack on them happened in May. In June, the Nigerian government fined them for switching off their AIS in the Nigerian exclusive economic zone, where they have no business being, because Nigeria currently do not have any agreement with any vessel. And so how are distant water fishing nations sponsoring the overexploitation or the plunder of fish stock on the African continent? They are doing this through subsidies. And a report that was published by Oceana in 2021 gave some example of how this is actually happening. Remember, I talked about legal fishing and the targeting of overexploited fish stock. So in countries like Somalia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Namibia, and Guinea-Bissau, for instance, the saltwater fishing fleets benefit from 17%, 27%, 35%, 41%, and 42%, respectively, of the total value of catch in the form of fisheries subsidies, of which, to a very large extent, without these subsidies, the fishing expedition would have been, not profitable. There wouldn't have been any need for them to actually come in the first place. And a lot of the species that they catch are in the categories of overexploited or depleted, and therefore shouldn't even be on the table in the first place. And so these are just some of the examples wherein, when we talk about sustainability on the one hand, but at the same time, those that have the power to preach sustainability and also the power to implement all this process of sustainability are, on the one hand or the other hand, the same people that are exporting the overexploitation to the detriment of the other people that they are preaching on sustainability to. So what are some of the impacts of these unsustainable practices and how they are contributing to undermining peace and security on the African continent? The first thing is, of course, is that they exacerbate depletion. Remember, I've talked about the other factors that contribute to depletion. They worsen efforts to improve fisheries governance. But before we get to that, when there's depletion, there is less catch, there is less money, there is unemployment, there is poverty. People become vulnerable. Fisher folk that have that knowledge becomes hopeless prey in the sight of criminal actors that need the knowledge that they have, which is why fisher folk actually is more susceptible to becoming an informant for a pirate group that do not have knowledge of the creeks, in the case of Niger Delta of Nigeria, for example, that do not have knowledge of the sea, that might not necessarily have the navigational skills. It's either you stay at home and have nothing, because it's not like these are countries that have the money to then provide or subsidize your lack of income or provide alternative source of livelihood. So the reality then is that the fisher folk that is losing their source of livelihood must find alternative, or must find creative ways of making ends meet. And a lot of the times, that alternative is engaging in illegal fishing. This is why I didn't, when I started my conversation, I said I'm not focusing on illegal fishing by the artisanal sector, because at least of the 13 coastal states in West and Central Africa I've been to due to my research, repeatedly, it's almost always the case that this wasn't the case before. We used to catch enough in 6 nautical miles, but now we don't even catch enough in 12 nautical miles. We have to go up to 50 nautical miles. You go to Sao Tome and Principe, a population of about 200,000 people with a vast area of the sea. You might think that the impact of depletion might not be felt by the fisher folk there in the same way that millions of people, about over 2 million people in Ghana that rely on fisheries, might feel the same impact. But interestingly, in Sao Tome and Principe, fisher folk are leaving up to the 12 nautical miles that is reserved to them and going up to 50 nautical miles, which is why in all the islands, in the communities, they tell you that they have 2 to 4 deaths each year. People leave in search of fish, but because they don't have compass, they never come back. And there are so many families that do not know whether their father, their brother, their cousins are dead or are ever coming back. But the reality is that they leave in search of fish and never come back. And a lot of the times, the NGO that is trying to support fisher folk and provide navigational compass, they actually cited that they're trying to do that, is that a lot of them go lost at sea because they don't know how to come back. And we also then, in the process of all these things happening, we see, if you're familiar with incidents of pirates and armed robbery at sea and how it's reported, you might have heard a lot of suspicious approach. And this suspicious approach is basically a case, sometimes it could be criminal-minded people, but a lot of the times they are also fisher folk that are going about their business, but the difference is that they are in places where they should not be. They are not in the 5 nautical miles assigned to them. They are in 20, 30, 45 nautical miles, and then they are accosted by ships. Sometimes they are shot at. Fisher folk have lost their lives in the hands of either industrial fishing vessels or ships that have suspected them of being pirates or armed robbers operating. and the reason why we got here in the first place is because of the impact of depleting fish stock and their desperation to make ends meet. And the way they are responding to this desperation is to engage in illegal fishing themselves. I don't know how clear this is, but these are just some of the cyclical representation of some of the crimes that people in coastal communities have either engaged in. People that once identified as fisher folk have either engaged in or are still engaging in somehow to be able to make ends meet. And because of all those responses and how they are responding to this vulnerability, it then undermines generally the peace and security of countries in Western Central Africa. And because of the presentation that was done by Professor Schofield, I want to also mention how this quest for fish, following the fish by artisanal fishers on the continent, can risk expediting the process of conflict, especially in areas where maritime boundaries is not delimited, or when it has been delimited but there's still tension, for example, between Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Peninsula. It has been settled since 2002, but the reality is also that gendarmeries from Cameroon continuously assault Nigerians that come from Nigeria to fish in the Bakassi area, because this is traditional fishing ground that they have known. And in 2017, it was reported that several Nigerian fishers were killed by the gendarmerie, to the point that Nigeria had to call the Cameroonian ambassador to answer this. We also see conflict between law enforcement in Mauritania attacking fisherfolk from Senegal. It's actually only recently that the country have sort of reached an agreement. We see conflict increasingly happening between fisherfolk from Cameroon going to Equatorial Guinea in search of fish. More recently, we're also seeing conflict between law enforcement in Sierra Leone and Guinea over disputed maritime boundary, because they question that the Guineans are coming into their water to enforce illegal fishing activities. So despite the fact that there are sort of agreements for countries to collectively address some of these threats, there are potential threats that could arise unless there's actually more honesty and a global collaboration around addressing the things that actually undermine the sustainability of fish stock, which in the long run have an implication on the livelihoods of people, which forces them to then go elsewhere in search of fish. So what are some of the responses of international communities? Well, we have the carding system by the EU, and I have talked about the yellow and then the red carding of Cameroon in 2023. We also have the fining of EU countries, wherein they actually fine the vessels that's been implicated if they are from their country. But you can see some of the amount that is being fined and how, and maybe then understand why illegal fishing is often described as low risk and high reward, because if this is the fine, then I can as well carry on, because I can afford to pay the fine. We then also, in sort of positive light, we see countries like China actually cancelling the subsidies and licenses of vessels that were in 2018 implicated for IUU fishing in West African countries. And we also seen improved fisheries governance and regulation and signing up to different international conventions, to the point that 26 of the 38 coastal states in Africa have signed up or ratified the PSMA. Of course, this is not the same as implementation, but signing up and ratifying is a sign, is a positive sign. And then we have ECOWAS countries signing a memorandum of understanding with regional fisheries advisory bodies that would allow them to collaborate more on addressing fisheries issues, which obviously would lead to more coherence rather than countries going it alone. But at the same time, we're also seeing the introduction of regulations that more or less targets the artisanal fishers, the most visible, the people that are in close proximity with law enforcement. Remember, we talked about the limited capacity of law enforcement agency, that they can't see what goes on the exclusive economic zone, but they can see what happens in territorial waters. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, the people they see is that they are artisanal fishers. And with this whole global noise about addressing IUU fishing, a lot of the times, at least in West Africa, some of the people that end up being more victimized are the people that are already vulnerable. In West Africa, we see closed season extended to fisher folk. In Ghana, for instance, and other West African countries are now going to adopt it from this year, without necessarily thinking about what are they going to be doing in that 1 month period. Remember, over 2 million people rely directly or indirectly on fishing. And so if you're talking about regulation to address something without also thinking about how you're likely to support those people to build resilience to their vulnerability, then you're opening a kind of worm in terms of how those people might become vulnerable and might become very creative in thinking about how do we get out of this? How do we make ends meet whilst we're waiting for you to address some of the issues that you have? But then there are also positive ways that technology is more or less helping so many of the countries on the continent address the problem. Remember, we talked about capacity being an issue, but we're seeing so many examples of how technology has helped countries to actually successfully interdict vessels that's been implicated for IUU fishing and also find them. And also with this whole process, they are then also recognizing the fact that they need to improve their laws. In Cote d'Ivoire, for example, during a joint exercise with the US law enforcement, they intercepted about 45 of the 64 vessels that they came across for IUU fishing. So you can imagine in Cote d'Ivoire alone, and this was in 2019. And I've talked about the Hey Yun Feng 11, so I'm just going to go through it because I'm already short of time. At the Gulf of Guinea level, this is coastal states in Western Central Africa, there is the YARIS, which is the Yaoundé Architecture Regional Information System. It also has helped the countries in the region to better address the threat of IUU fishing. So for example, they were able to stop an Egyptian flag vessel in Guinea for fishing in areas that is restricted to it at a time when there is a fishing ban. But this example also highlights the presentation by Professor Clive, in that even though this is supposedly a win for Guinea and celebrated by the region, it made Sierra Leone question, hang on a minute, was it actually your water or was it our water? And so this is also how, you would assume that addressing or combating IUU fishing, it's a win for transboundary resources, for example. But when there are questions about the limitations, and now that so many countries are really keen to exploit the resources in their oceans, especially with the opportunities potentially of offshore oil exploration, unless things like this are addressed in a way that countries can understand the benefit of collectively collaborating, it might unfortunately end up being a weak point for collaboration for Western Central African countries. And then in November, there's also an example which might also give us the link between illegal fishing and other fisheries crime, in that although this particular vessel is not implicated for illegal fishing, but this was not what they were looking for. These vessels were engaging in illegal oil bunkering. And so I talked about how IUU fishing or illegal fishing might be linked to other threats. But the fact that a lot of the times law enforcement, I think this was also a point that was made by Dihia yesterday, they are looking for one particular thing. And so perhaps there is a need for us to be more open in the way that law enforcement agents are trained and are also collaborating, so that even though the examples I've cited are success stories, but even though you're looking for illegal fishing, for instance, you should also be checking for other things, or have the knowledge at least to either check for other things or work collaboratively with those that are in drug law enforcement, for instance, or those that are in the navies. A lot of the times, however, the reality on the African continent is that the people that have the vessels and therefore able to interdict are the Navy. And we're seeing increasingly collaboration between the navies and the fisheries agencies and the drug law enforcement agencies, which is why some of the success stories I'm citing is happening. It is not the case, at least to the best of my knowledge, that there are fisheries agencies that have functional, at least in Western Central Africa, that have functional vessels to be able to interdict. But increasingly, we're seeing this cooperation and collaboration between the navies, which is a positive thing. And so what can we do differently? There is a need for a holistic approach to oceans governance and security on the African continent, wherein interagency cooperation and collaboration is strengthened. There's also a need for transparency. If we don't know anything about the agreement or the fisheries agreement, we can never really know or talk about corruption or how this money is spent if the negotiations are done in secret. If the communities that are likely to benefit or be affected by the negotiations or the agreements are not actually on the table when some of these negotiations are being done. Technology can help, but there's also a need for synergy. In Western Central Africa, we have a lot of, different countries coming in to help, which is a good thing. But a lot of the times, the left doesn't know what the right is doing, and you end up seeing a lot of replication, which ends up becoming a waste of resources and waste of money. The money that could have been directed to other things is being wasted because country A is replicating what country B have done or is doing, and this is happening because at the international level or the external partner level, they're not speaking to each other. There's also need for investment in MD infrastructure, especially on vessels, because of course technology can help us see, but you need to then also go and verify for that to be more effective, especially when you have the laws in place. At the heart of all this is the cooperation and collaboration between coastal states on the African continent and their neighbors. International corporations that sees flag states cooperating with port states is absolutely very important. And one other thing I want to highlight, I don't know how visible the map is, but one other thing I want to highlight, since I talked about how technology can help, is for us to know that technology is not a substitute for human, which is why, as we're also thinking about technology, we should also be thinking about how humans are adapting or have the knowledge to operate those technology, and also understanding how those technology can work or be understood differently to be more effective. And so what we have on this map is basically a representation of what I have noted here, apart from the fact that I noted also on this picture that there is a need for countries to think very strongly about suspending harmful subsidies. I know that the WTO have more or less reached this agreement last year, but it hasn't been implemented, and unless we see it, for now it's still a case of, well, harmful subsidies is a very big issue that contributes to the legal overexploitation of depleted stock, and have to be one of the first places that we should start from if we want to have an honest conversation about ensuring sustainable fisheries and safeguarding livelihoods for millions of people on the African continent. In conclusion, criminal-minded actors will always find creative ways to circumvent the laws. However, the use of technology grounded in improved human capacity, cooperation and collaboration by coastal states and their international partners, existing loopholes can be closed, ensuring that those that falter the laws are captured and prosecuted, which will deter for the criminals. And the image you see on your right more or less represents a holistic representation of the exploitation of the blue economy, wherein equity or social well-being and ecological conservation, including economic growth, is prioritized together. And with that happening, when it comes to addressing maritime security threats on the continent, there's also a holistic picture to it, rather than prioritizing one threat over the other. I'd like to conclude by paraphrasing a quote that is credited to Admiral Lord Fisher in 1904, and he noted, "If we lose command of the sea, it is not invasion we must fear, but starvation." This is a reality for millions of people on the African continent, and I think it's time we stopped the conversation and really start acting. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ife, for a very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure there'll be one or two questions from the audience. Would you like to? Yeah, we have one from Clive and then Medina.
Thank you ever so much for that presentation and for raising the maritime delimitation cases that you mentioned, particularly around Nigeria, Cameroon. I was actually part of that case as part of the Nigerian team when I was younger and more foolish than I am now, trailing around the land boundary in particular. But on the maritime side, this is more a statement than a question. Actually, it's a plea. If you are ever in a position where you're thinking about the only way forward in a deadlock negotiation is to go to the International Court of Justice, particularly, or the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, I would beg you to keep exploring the negotiated option. Particularly from speaking as a geographer from a technical perspective, courts don't deal well with technical issues. They also don't resolve the entirety of the dispute. The court will always answer the question that you ask of it. So that's a critical element at the start of the equation, is to agree on what question to pose to the court. In Nigeria, Cameroon, for example, the court did indeed draw a maritime boundary. It's riddled with technical errors. It doesn't have a reference of the coordinates to a geodetic datum, that is the mathematical model of the world. It's impossible to find the exact location of those coordinates for the turning points of the line delimited by the court. They failed to find an equidistant point, which they were intending to do. When you have a final and binding decision from a court, you end up with a situation that they do indeed draw you a line, but they don't resolve the management of the people and the resources on either side of that line. So it left Cameroon and Nigeria having spent 8 years in The Hague before the International Court of Justice, having to go back to negotiate again with each other to try and resolve the management issues across the line, and involving the people who considered themselves Nigerians in Bakassi Peninsula, who ended up in Cameroon. I would seriously reconsider if you're thinking about going to court. As an example, in recent cases, the most recent case on delimitation, Somalia and Kenya, decided in October of last year, the court, and I don't really blame the court for this, used the nautical chart that the parties agreed upon. Okay, that's fair enough. It's at 1 to 350,000 scale, so 1 millimeter is 350 meters on the ground. It's an inappropriately small scale for the purpose of defining where your baselines are. If you look at a nautical chart, there's a survey diagram, a confidence diagram on it, which gives you an idea of when the surveys were taken that produce, are made up, or merged to produce the chart. The Kenyan coast was surveyed in 1961 to 64 by the UK Hydrographic Office. The Somali coastline was surveyed by the Italian Navy in 1942. So you're dealing with surveys 60 to 80 years old as the basis for delimiting a maritime boundary now. We have much better technology these days. We have sub-meter satellite imagery to work with. But actually that case was better than Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, where the coastline, that part of the chart that represents the coastline, was surveyed between 1840 and 1870. The chart shows a wavy line for the coast. It's indicative, it's cartographic shorthand for I'm not really sure. And that was used as the base points to produce the maritime boundary. Courts, I don't mean to attack my legal friends, but courts are remarkably cautious about using technology. We have fantastic satellite imagery. Our friends from Global Fishing Watch will testify to that, which can be incredibly useful for maritime delimitation and resolving maritime disputes. But courts deal with this type of issue in my opinion, in an untransparent way, and they leave then problems, even though they deliver you a final and binding judgment, which you then have to address through negotiations in any case. Negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps this would be a good time to note that this is why I'm a fan of, I know in your presentation you didn't quite agree, but I'd rather, given the context of a lot of the conflict and the need for countries on the continent to collaborate more, I'm a fan of joint management agreement or joint development zones, especially when it's done fairly. We have a case of Guinea-Bissau and Senegal that are supposed to have, shared, or part of the agreement was to jointly develop their zone, but the sharing of the resources was 50-50 for fisheries, but at the time for petroleum resources was 20-80, 20 for Guinea-Bissau and 80 for Senegal. And now I think for the last 5 years, it's time for the agreement to be renewed. And a lot of the stalemate, even though Guinea-Bissau is more or less still unstable for political reasons, that renegotiation is being delayed because they are saying if we're going to renegotiate or re-agree, sort of resign this agreement, it has to be equitable. So I feel that joint development zone and joint management arrangement can work if it's fair and done equitably. It becomes problematic when the scenarios like this occur. And the fact that countries need to cooperate and collaborate, I feel that African countries should actually strongly consider joint management zone that's spending years in courts. As we've seen from the Kenya-Somalia, Kenya basically said we do not recognize the jurisdiction of the ICJ, and the diplomatic relationship, unfortunately, between the two countries is still something that is likely to affect, unless addressed, affect their ability to negotiate and cooperate on other issues, one of which includes the problem of Al-Shabaab and terrorism in the Horn of Africa. So thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you both. Medina Thiam from Senegal, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Ife, for your brilliant presentation. I want to add just 2 observations. The first is about the gender element in IU fishing, and particularly collecting data, because it is really tricky to have this data in my country, for example, to know exactly the role of women and responsibilities of women in fisheries crime or violations, or even their implication in fisheries law enforcement. Secondly, it is about cooperation. We have agreements, regional agreements, and bilateral agreements in terms of cooperation, but they are made at a high level. So populations sometimes are not really implicated, and we need to raise awareness and to put them inside. We must have a kind of inclusive collaboration when signing those agreements, because, for example, you were highlighting this issue between Senegal and Mauritania. When we have Senegalese fishermen entering in the Mauritanian waters, they are just for them following the migratory fish, and it is not at all a concern of IU fishing for them, because they used to historically. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I agree with you on the second point. I also agree with you on the first point, but just wanted to add, so in recent times I've been working with the UNODC doing this research on the gendered nature of maritime criminality in Western Central Africa. And interestingly, even though, and this is why it is very important for us to also try to see the gendered element of everything. I've talked about the good thing in terms of the contribution of women, but at the same time, that good contribution also means that sometimes they are the invisible hands to the maritime crime that is committed by the men. Although they are not at sea committing the crime, they are the ones, either when it comes to oil bunkering, the ones buying the port, the cooking pot, the one providing information around when the navies are going to come, the ones that are financing the illegal fishing activities, that know that you need to come back with the fish, otherwise I'm not going to continue with this business arrangement. So and an understanding of this gendered nature of crime, both positive and negative, also helps law enforcement. Than this picture of seeing women sometimes as just vulnerable, meek, and victims. It doesn't help you with having the real picture of addressing some of these crimes, because a lot of the times, like I said, women can be the invisible hands that are sponsoring the activities or the illegal activities that men are able to conduct at sea. So definitely further research is needed across the region to sort of understand the good and bad around how men and women are contributing positively and negatively to maritime law enforcement, and also marine conservation and maritime threats in general. So thank you so much for the comments.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you particularly, Ife. I think a round of applause for her.